They laughed when I paid $1 for 50 acres of kudzu so thick it had swallowed a barn hole. That was March of 2022, 6 months after my grandfather Earl Calloway died, and the county clerk actually asked me twice if I understood what I was buying. If you've ever watched something you loved get buried alive by something green and patient, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Then like and subscribe before this story eats you the way that Vine ate my land. 3 things were happening at once, and none of them were finished for a long time. First, a man named Roland Caldwell from Meridian Point Development wanted my 50 acres for a highway rest stop and outlet plaza, and he had 90 days before a county easement vote made his offer disappear. Second, the whole town of Hartwell Bend already thought I was the fool who'd inherited a debt trap instead of a farm, and they weren't shy about saying so to my face. Third, tucked inside my grandfather's tool shed was a stack of 14 leather ledgers going back to 1968, and somewhere under 6 feet of kudzu was something he'd written about but never showed anyone alive. I didn't know yet that a truckload of 43 Kiko goats would be the thing that cracked all 3 open. My grandfather Earl worked that land for 51 years before his heart gave out in a hospital bed in Dahlonega in September of 2021. I was 29 then, living in Athens, answering phones for an insurance adjuster, and the last real conversation I had with him was over a static phone line where he told me, "The land remembers longer than the bank does, Ren." I wrote it on a napkin because I thought it was just an old man being poetic. I didn't understand until 18 months later that he meant it as an instruction. The kudzu wasn't always there. Earl planted it himself in 1974, back when the Soil Conservation Service was paying farmers a bounty to plant it for erosion control, and it did exactly what erosion control vines do when nobody stops them. It ate everything. By the time he died, it had swallowed the lower pasture, climbed over an old equipment shed, and buried something in the northeast corner that even his neighbors had forgotten existed. Kudzu grows a foot a day in a good Georgia summer, and Earl used to say you could hear it working if you stood still enough at dusk, a dry rustling like paper being crumpled somewhere just out of sight. I didn't believe him until I stood on that land myself the week after closing, at 7 in the evening, and heard exactly that sound coming from every direction at once. The county tax office had the parcel listed as unimproved agricultural delinquent, which is how I ended up able to buy it for $1 plus $14,200 in back taxes, penalties, and a lien I paid off with my entire savings account and a loan against my grandmother's old Buick. Hartwell Bend is a town of 1,100 people where everybody's business is public record, whether they filed it or not. Within a week of the closing, Bobby Sykes, who farms 300 acres of soybeans directly across the county road from me, was telling anyone who'd stand still at the Pig Iron Diner that Earl Calloway's granddaughter had paid good money for a briar patch and a dead man's fantasy. He said it with a laugh every single time, like it was a joke that improved with age. I heard about it secondhand for months before I ever heard it from his own mouth. Caldwell showed up 11 days after the deed transferred, driving a white Range Rover down a dirt track that hadn't seen anything nicer than a hay truck in a decade, wearing shoes that cost more than my monthly groceries and were ruined by the driveway before he even reached my porch. He introduced himself as representing Meridian Point Development and said the company wanted to build a rest stop and retail plaza off the new Highway 76 interchange, and that 50 acres of, in his words, essentially wasteland, were standing in the way of an easement corridor. He offered $41,000. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He smiled the way men smile when they've already decided you're going to lose, told me to think it over, and left a card on my porch rail that I didn't pick up until the rain had already curled its corners. Caldwell came back 9 days later with a number that made my hands shake for a different reason. $88,000, more than double, with a letter attached from a county attorney reminding me that the easement vote was scheduled for June the 14th, and that after that date the corridor could be condemned through eminent domain for public infrastructure benefit at a fraction of fair market value. He sat on my porch steps, uninvited, and told me that grief makes people sentimental about dirt that doesn't love them back. I told him I had 90 days, and he had 0 acres, and he could enjoy his drive back to Atlanta. He didn't smile that time. That same week, I finally started clearing the tool shed, and that's where I found the ledgers. 14 leather-bound notebooks, cracked at the spines, filled with Earl's blocky handwriting in pencil that had gone silver with age. Rainfall totals. Which fence line flooded first? The exact week the persimmons dropped every year since 1979. And scattered through the last 3 books, a phrase that appeared 11 separate times, always in the same 6 words. Goats in the northeast corner. Not yet. He never explained what not yet meant, or what waited in that corner besides 40 years of kudzu rooted 12 feet deep in places, but he'd underlined it twice in 2019, the year before his diagnosis. I called the county extension office because I genuinely didn't understand what I was looking at, and that's how I met Dale Pruitt, the district agricultural agent, a man with a laminated badge and a folder of USDA herbicide protocols he handed me before I'd finished my sentence. He told me kudzu removal required triclopyr application on a strict 18-month cycle, that goat browsing was a folk remedy with no peer-reviewed yield data, and that anyone recommending livestock over registered herbicide was, in his words, selling nostalgia, not agronomy. He said it standing in my own driveway, tapping the folder against his palm like a man closing a case. I told him I'd read the label. He told me to read it twice. I spent $11,000, nearly everything left after the tax lien, on 43 Kiko goats trucked in from a breeder outside Statesville, North Carolina, on the second Saturday of May. The truck backed down my driveway smelling like diesel and wet hay, and when the ramp dropped, 30-some goats poured out into a wall of green so tall it swallowed their backs within 4 steps. The breeder, a wiry man named Curtis Boyle who'd sold goats to half of North Carolina for 20 years, stood at the tailgate counting heads off a clipboard and told me flatly that most people who bought browsing herds this size quit within the first 6 weeks, once they realized goats don't clear land so much as negotiate with it, paddock by paddock, one stubborn vine at a time. I told him I wasn't most people. He shrugged, said everyone tells him that, and drove off before the dust from his tires had even settled back onto the road. Bobby Sykes drove past on the county road twice that afternoon, slow both times, and didn't wave either time. I remember the exact sound of 43 hooves hitting packed dirt for the first time, a sound like heavy rain starting all at once, and the smell that rose up out of the crushed kudzu within the hour. Green and bitter and strangely sweet at the edges, like cut grass gone slightly wrong. I stood at the fence line until dark that first night, watching them work, and I thought about Earl's handwriting, and I thought that if this failed, I would have spent the last of my inheritance proving a dead man's private joke to an empty pasture. I moved into the tool shed for the summer because the goats needed watching every daylight hour, and I learned the sound of 43 animals working a kudzu wall the way you learn a language, the low tearing hiss of leaves stripped at the stem, the clatter of hooves on buried fieldstone, the specific bleat that meant a doe had found something worth fighting a sibling over. My hands cracked and bled in the creases from moving fence panels twice a day. I ate cold beans out of the can more nights than I want to admit, and some nights I sat on an overturned bucket reading Earl's ledgers by headlamp, tracing his handwriting with my finger like it might answer back. Dale Pruitt came out a second time in July, unannounced, after someone reported livestock browsing near a county drainage easement. He stood at the fence line in pressed khakis, watched the goats work a slope Earl's notes called the Old South Terrace, and told me that unmanaged browsing would create bare soil erosion within one growing season, that he'd seen it in Franklin County and it wasn't pretty, and that I ought to consider it before the runoff reached the creek. I asked him if he'd read the part of the ledger where my grandfather rotated goat paddocks every 11 days for exactly this reason. He hadn't asked to see the ledger. He left a citation warning in my mailbox 2 days later anyway, for browsing within 50 feet of a drainage right-of-way, and I paid the $80 fine without arguing, because arguing costs more than $80 in a town like this. By August, the goats had stripped the equipment shed bare enough that I could see rusted tin siding for the first time since before I was born, and by the second week of September, they'd opened a gap in the northeast corner, wide enough to walk through standing up. That's where I found it, 11 rows of trees, gnarled and vine-choked but alive, trunks thick as my thigh, set in the kind of deliberate grid nobody accidentally plants, An orchard. Muscadine and scuppernong vines woven through old variety apple and pear trees that Earl's earliest ledger, dated 1968, listed by name. Arkansas black, horseapple, Kiefer pear, 110 trees his own father had put in the ground in 1951, then abandoned when the kudzu bounty made the government pay him more to bury it than the fruit had ever earned him to keep it. I remember standing in that gap with kudzu leaves still clinging to my sleeves, and the smell of crushed vine thick in the air, running my hand over bark that felt like it had been waiting under all that green for someone specific to show up. The trees were gnarled in a way that told a story, if you knew how to read bark, the way Earl had taught me to read weather. Old pruning scars healed crooked, deer rub marks from decades of winters, a burn scar, low on one trunk, that the 1968 ledger explained in 4 blunt words. Lightning, South Row, survived. I sat down right there in the dirt between 2 rows and cried for the first time since the funeral, not because I was sad, but because for one entire minute I understood exactly what my grandfather had been protecting with his silence. If you've ever uncovered something your own family buried on purpose, hit subscribe right now, because what these trees cost me, before anyone believed they were real, is the next part of this story. Bobby Sykes found out about the orchard before Caldwell did, because Hartwell Bend doesn't keep secrets longer than a week. He drove over uninvited, stood at my new gap in the fence and laughed, an actual laugh, not a chuckle, and said Earl Calloway's granddaughter had spent $11,000 on goats to dig up her granddaddy's biggest failure. He said the orchard had been left to rot for a reason. Apples don't sell for enough in this county to matter, and vine fruit rots on the truck before it reaches Atlanta. I told him I hadn't asked his opinion on my inheritance. He told me he'd give it anyway, free of charge, like he always had. He wasn't wrong that nobody in 3 counties had made real money on heirloom fruit in a generation. He was wrong about why. I called an agricultural appraiser out of Gainesville that same month, a woman named Carol Whitfield who'd written for a farming trade paper before switching careers, and she walked the rows with a notepad and didn't laugh once. She told me Arkansas black apples and Kiefer pears were exactly the varieties boutique cideries and heirloom produce buyers in Atlanta and Asheville were desperate for and couldn't source, because nobody had planted them commercially since the 1950s. She didn't promise me anything. She took photographs, said she'd make calls, and left. It was the first time in 11 months that anyone had looked at that land and seen an asset instead of a punchline or a parcel number. Caldwell's company sent someone else in October, a junior attorney named Sandra Denton, sharp-suited, apologetic in a way that felt rehearsed, who told me Meridian Point wanted to resolve this cleanly before the easement vote and had authorized her to offer $130,000, final, with a 48-hour window. She said it like a kindness. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Meridian Point's engineers had already filed preliminary drainage plans with the county that ran straight through my northeast corner, orchard and all, regardless of whether I signed. I asked her if that was legal before a condemnation ruling. She said the paperwork was exploratory. I told her exploratory paperwork doesn't need my signature, so she could exploration herself back to the highway. Denton came back a second time in late October, alone, no folder this time, and told me, almost kindly, in a tone that felt more dangerous than Caldwell's had ever sounded, that Meridian Point's legal team had already flagged my sentimental attachment to the property as a factor working against me in any condemnation hearing, since courts historically award lower compensation when an owner is perceived as emotionally rather than commercially motivated. She said it like she was doing me a favor by warning me. I told her I wasn't attached to dirt. I was attached to $11,000 of goats and 14 ledgers of proof, and those weren't sentimental, they were assets, and she could tell her legal team to reconsider which side of that line I was standing on. She wrote something down. I never found out what. That same week, the bank that held the note on Earl's old tractor called it due in full, 30 days, citing a clause I hadn't read closely enough when I refinanced the loan against my grandmother's Buick. It was legal, and it was also the second time in a month that paperwork had moved faster than I could read it. I sat in the tool shed that night with all 14 ledgers spread across the floor, and for the first time since the truck of goats arrived, I let myself think the thought I'd been keeping at arm's length. Maybe Bobby Sykes was right. Maybe I'd spent every dollar I had proving a dead man's private joke. Then I found the page. Earl's last ledger, the one dated the spring before he died, had a single entry I'd skipped past twice. Told Denny Whitfield's girl the trees were still good under there. She didn't believe an old man neither. That's fine. Patience isn't a thing you explain, it's a thing you survive. Denny Whitfield was Carol's father, dead 11 years, a man Earl used to trade seed with. He hadn't written that note for me specifically. He'd written it because he'd been proven right exactly once before, decades earlier, by exactly nobody who believed him at the time either. I closed the ledger, called the bank in the morning, and asked for 30 days to sell fruit instead of 30 days to fold. The drought that hit North Georgia the following August was the worst the region had logged since 1998, and it landed exactly when my 110 trees had finished their second full season of goat-cleared, root-aerated, undisturbed soil. Bobby Sykes's soybeans, sprayed on the same triclopyr and glyphosate rotation while Dale Pruitt had recommended to half the county for a decade, curled brown by mid-July across 300 acres, their topsoil cracked into plates you could lift with 2 fingers, stripped of the organic structure that thick root systems and browsing animals build back into ground season over season. My orchard rose, threaded through with muscadine vines that had spent 2 years pulling moisture from 6 feet down instead of 6 inches, dropped their heaviest yield in 70 years, 9,000 pounds of Arkansas black and Kiefer pear off 11 rows, and the muscadine vines came in so heavy, Carol Whitfield had to rent a second truck. I remember standing in the south row at 6 in the morning that August, the air already hot enough to feel solid, breathing in the smell of sun-warmed fruit and dry dust, and the faint diesel tang off the second truck's engine, watching Kiko goats pick through browse in paddock 4, while the whole rest of the county's soybean fields shimmered brown in the distance, like something already gone. Earl's ledger from 1988 had a line I read 3 times that morning. Drought don't punish the land, it punishes what you did to the land beforehand. I finally understood it wasn't poetry either. The county extension office, the same office that issued me an $80 citation, put out a drought advisory that August, blaming unprecedented conditions for regional crop failure, and quietly stopped mentioning triclopyr rotation schedules in its weekly bulletin. Dale Pruitt didn't call to apologize. He didn't have to. Every farmer in Hartwell Bend who drove past my fence line that month could see for himself which 50 acres in the county weren't cracked open like a dropped plate. Roland Caldwell called me himself in September. No letter, no attorney this time. Meridian Point's highway interchange had gone forward without my northeast corner, and the Rest Stop Plaza's landscaping contractor, contractually obligated to source drought-resilient regional plantings for a sustainability tax credit the county had tied to the project, couldn't find a single commercial orchard within 90 miles that had survived the summer intact. Mine was the only one. He didn't call it a favor, he called it an opportunity for partnership, and asked to meet at the county agricultural fairgrounds where the extension office was hosting its annual harvest weigh-in, the same event where Dale Pruitt posted county yield numbers on a public board every year for anyone to see. I agreed to meet him there, in public, on purpose. Carol Whitfield agreed to bring her scale and her notepad. I told Caldwell to bring whatever number he thought was fair, and to bring it in front of witnesses, because I was done negotiating on porches and in letters that disappeared into filing cabinets. He showed up in the same white Range Rover, cleaner shoes this time, and for the first time since he'd first stepped onto my land, he arrived early. The Hartwell Bend Fairgrounds weigh-in draws maybe 200 people on a good Saturday. Farmers, their families, the extension office staff, a stringer from the county paper who covers it every year, because nothing else happens that week. Dale Pruitt ran the scale personally, same as always, calling out numbers for the board while a volunteer chalked them up under each grower's name. Bobby Sykes was there too, soybean numbers already posted, down 41% from the prior year, the worst yield of his 18 seasons farming that ground, and he stood near the fence line not meeting anyone's eyes. When my turn came, Carol Whitfield helped me haul the crates up myself, no hired hands, same as I'd done every load since May. 9,000 pounds off 11 rows, weighed in front of the whole crowd, chalked onto the board in Dale Pruitt's own handwriting because he couldn't exactly refuse to do his job in front of 200 witnesses. Someone in the crowd asked, loud enough for the board to hear, how land Bobby Sykes had called a briar patch 18 months earlier had out-yielded triclopyr-treated cropland 3 counties wide during the worst drought since 1998. Nobody answered right away. Dale Pruitt looked at the chalk in his own hand like it had betrayed him. He cleared his throat, glanced at the crowd, and said only that browsing management shows promise as a supplementary practice, which was the closest thing to a retraction 200 people were ever going to get out of him, and it was enough. Somewhere behind him, I heard a farmer I didn't even know murmur to his wife that he'd been meaning to look into goats for his own back. 40 for 3 years now, and maybe this was the year. Caldwell stepped up next, in front of the same crowd, and offered $210,000 for the Northeast 11 rows alone, plus a standing supply contract for Meridian Point's landscaping and retail plaza at market rate, renewable annually, no purchase of the remaining acreage required. I told him, in front of Dale Pruitt, in front of Bobby Sykes, in front of the county paper's stringer with her notebook already open, that I'd sell him fruit, not land, on a 5-year contract I'd write myself, with a clause requiring Meridian Point to credit the orchard's origin on every retail sign at that plaza. He agreed before I finished the sentence. I didn't smile the way he used to smile at me. I just wrote the number down and let him sign it standing up, in the dirt, the way every real deal in that county had ever been made. Dale Pruitt kept his position with the extension office for another 2 years, but the county quietly folded goat browsing and cover crop rotation into its official erosion guidance the following spring, without ever crediting whose 50 acres had forced the update, and he stopped mentioning peer-reviewed yield data every time livestock came up at a farm meeting. Bobby Sykes sold off a third of his soybean acreage in 2027 and leased it back to me for muscadine expansion, at a rate he negotiated himself, quietly, without ever mentioning the word sorry out loud. He still hasn't, and I've stopped waiting for it. Sandra Denton left Meridian Point for a land use compliance firm in Atlanta 2 years later, and once, at a regional agriculture conference, introduced herself to me as someone who'd learned a great deal from the Callaway parcel, which is as close to an apology as corporate language gets, and I let it stand. Roland Caldwell renewed the supply contract every single year for the next 11 years without renegotiating a single clause, because Meridian Point's plaza never found another regional orchard that survived a drought the way mine had, and every retail sign at that rest stop still reads, "Fruit sourced from Callaway Orchard, Est." 1951, in letters he never once tried to shrink. I never sold a single acre outright, never took a lump sum buyout, and never let a distributor push me into spraying anything Earl wouldn't have recognized. By 2034, the orchard had grown to 31 rows, the goat herd to 80-some head, rotating 6 paddocks on an 11-day cycle, exactly like Earl's notes specified, and I'd filled 6 ledgers of my own, in pencil, blocky handwriting I didn't realize until my 40s I'd inherited along with the land. Last spring I handed the first of Earl's original 14 ledgers to my niece, Ada, 17 years old, who'd spent every summer since she was 9 following me through those rows, asking questions I used to think were annoying, and now understand were the only inheritance that mattered. She turned it over in her hands the same way I once did, tracing the cracked spine, smelling the same leather and pencil graphite smell that still makes my chest tighten 11 years later, and asked me if she was allowed to write in it too, right alongside Earl's entries, instead of starting a fresh book of her own. I told her that was exactly the point, that the ledger was never supposed to end, only continue, the way the orchard rows kept extending a little further into ground the kudzu used to own outright. I didn't tell her what to do with it. I told her what Earl told me on a static phone line the year before he died. The land remembers longer than the bank does, and it never once asks you to be right immediately, only eventually. How many things in your own life are you still calling foolish, simply because they haven't finished proving you wrong yet? Ada asked me once why Earl never once mentioned the orchard out loud to anyone in 51 years, not even to his own son, and I was still turning that question over in my mouth, unanswered, when the county called about the northeast fence line again, The same fence line, a different reason entirely, one I hadn't seen coming any more than I'd seen the first offer coming 11 years earlier. And if you've made it this far with me, you already know exactly the kind of person who keeps watching instead of walking away. So go ahead and subscribe, because the next one starts with a fence line and ends somewhere none of us expected either.